Hey everyone, I thought I'd do a walking vlog this time, just for a bit of a change of pace. So, anyway, this video is going to be my counterpart to the earlier video I made, in which I talked about how the 1990s were a really unique historical epoch, where an incredible seismic change happened in the cultural landscape. That was the death of monoculture. It was a turning point in history where fashion trends, music trends, cultural trends were no longer centralized by controlled media like the radio, TV, and the institutions. The internet instead gave birth to a whole sort of cultural stasis where all of these cultural trends, all these niches, they, instead of one gaining eminence, instead of one gaining preeminence over the other, dominance over the other, they would all remain static, and nothing would dominate the mainstream one way or the other. That's what I mean by the death of the monoculture. But then, of course, I didn't mention at any point the political changes that took place during the 90s, which I think in a lot of ways were equally as noticeable and definitely worthy of discussion, worthy of being talked about as the death of monoculture. And that is the end of history phenomenon. So in a lot of ways, I would argue, and many other people have argued this, many other commentators and pundits who I agree with, they've made the point that in much the same way that our culture has remained relatively quite stagnant since the late 1990s, our political class have also remained stuck in the 1990s. In terms of certainly everyone within our ministerial cabinet, the vast majority of our elected representatives in Westminster, our entire political class, all these boomers, they are all stuck in the headspace and the mentality of the cool Britannia wave that surged through the 90s, and of course the end of history. So what was the end of history? Well, the end of history is the name of a book that was published in 1992 by Francis Fukuyama. Now, I have not personally read the book, but I have had it summarized to me, and at some point I ought to stop talking about books that I've never read and actually take the time to read them. But I'm not a fast reader, okay? But anyway, this was quite an interesting book, and it's not a book that would have come about were it not for the time period and the cultural zeitgeist and the factors and circumstances that created it. So anyway, The End of History was a book that essentially argued that now that the ideologies of fascism and communism had been defeated, all these various different political ideologies had been put to the test in the great big petri dish that is global geopolitics, and in the end, liberal democracy remained triumphant among them all. Of course, for those of you who understand the historical factors that were going on at the time, in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. So East and West Germany, after decades of being divided under Soviet communism and Western liberalism, they'd finally been reunited once again. And then, of course, in 1990, or was it 1991? I don't know the exact year, the Soviet Union collapsed. Yes, it's funny to think back how nobody knew if or when the Soviet Union would just collapse. But then, all of a sudden, what the hell's going on? Some lunatic is screaming, "Wee!" It's really driving me to distraction. I might have to edit this out. Anyway, so the Soviet Union collapsed really suddenly. Now, I don't want to talk about what led to the Soviet Union's collapse, but shut up. Who the hell keeps screaming? It's pissing me off. Don't think straight. Anyway, so Anyway, for the first time, I think in recorded history, America had emerged triumphant as the hub of global economic and military power. So we were living in the heyday of the Pax Americana. America was the hub of the global economy. It was the place to be. It was where the ruling ideology of liberal democracy was, and people felt a sense of triumphant global euphoria. Like, we defeated communism, we defeated fascism, and now we've saved the world, or we have an obligation to save the world and save those poor people who don't have liberal democracies. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing what other people have paraphrased, but yes, that's the thesis of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. So, now that we've defeated all the other ideologies, we need to export liberal democracy to all the corners of the globe. And then there will be no more wars, there'll be no more tyranny, there'll be world peace all over, and the only problems that people will face from this point onwards is boredom. That's why he called it the end of history. Obviously, you see this recurring theme, this recurring liberal theme, which you often hear even now, that we're marching towards an inevitable destination, a progress. That's what they often say. They say that we're advancing towards progress, the emancipation of all the marginalized. This is an idea which I think took root much earlier, but it was beginning to gain a lot more traction, certainly by the early 90s, because that was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So anyway, this is what I mean when I refer to the end of history. And it's why the 90s seemed like such a jolly and euphoric time. I mean, first of all, there was an economic boom in the UK. A lot of people say that this was to do with Thatcher's economic policy reforms, and again, I don't claim to be an expert on that, but people were doing pretty good back in those times. And this was partly what led to the emergent cultural phenomenon known as Cool Britannia. So we saw this Cambrian explosion of Britpop, unapologetically British or English rock bands like Blur, Oasis, and the Spice Girls. And most notably, there was one of the members of the Spice Girls, was it Jerry Halliwell? I forget. She wore this dress that had the Union Jack on it, and Liam Gallagher, was it Liam or was it Noel? I forget. He had a guitar with the Union Jack on it. And then there were films that were made like 4 Weddings and a Funeral with Hugh Grant, and Hugh Grant became a British icon, Colin Firth as well. So it was a very jolly time. It seemed, definitely, comparatively speaking, the 90s were a much better time compared to now. In the late 90s, at around 1997, May 1997, was the new Labour revolution. It was when that nefarious mastermind, that real life Emperor Palpatine, Tony Blair, is when he was the leader of the Labour Party, and he became the British Prime Minister by a landslide. And that's another thing that needs to be talked about. As I said earlier, everyone within our ministerial cabinet and the vast majority of people in Westminster, they are still locked within this cultural zeitgeist of the late 90s. It all started with Tony Blair. So Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, John Smith, and Peter Mandelson, and all the other leading apparatchiks of the then Labour Party, they managed to revolutionize the Labour Party in a way that was new and groundbreaking. See, before Tony Blair and John Smith took over the Labour Party was mainly, it was a socialist party. It was filled with people like Jeremy Corbyn and Neil Kinnock, where essentially they wanted more government spending and more taxing of the rich, which resonated a lot with people who worked in working class communities and people who are ideologically socialist. But the problem is, people didn't want socialism, because in the late 70s we lived under a socialist government and nothing worked. There were these strikes happening all over the country. The trade unions had too much power and they were abusing it. They were constantly making demands. The power kept going out. I think this is what they called the winter of discontent. And that's why people wonder why Margaret Thatcher reigned as long as she did, why she stayed in office for 2.5, I think it was, terms, why the Tories were kept in power throughout the 80s. It's because it was all a reaction to what came before it, that is socialism. But if Thatcher was a reaction to the socialism of the late 70s, then Blair was a reaction to the Thatcherism of the 80s. But Blair was a lot smarter than people realize, because what he did was he sort of amalgamated the socialism of the old Labour Party and the neoliberal capitalism of the Tory Party, and he blended them together. This is what I think. This is essentially what's meant by the new Labour. It was very new. It was they were economically liberal. First of all, this is part of the reason why Tony Blair inaugurated the age of mass immigration. It all started with Tony Blair. Like, if you look back at all the historic immigration figures, there were very little numbers of immigration throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., and virtually none during the 80s. But then when Blair gets into power, suddenly the numbers go up and up and up. It begins to enter 6 figures by the 2000s, and then it just goes colossal throughout the 2020s in our current age. Now, from an economics perspective, mass immigration, it may not necessarily be good for unskilled workers, for the working class, but it's good for GDP, because you're devaluing the labor for all people on the lowest rung of the economic ladder. You're making it cheaper for big businesses to hire unskilled workers, and make no mistake, a lot of big businesses have been lobbying for mass immigration. So it was kind of like a confluence of big business interests. But of course, it was ideological as well. It was definitely 100% ideological as well. And that's another thing I need to discuss, because again, the 90s was such a euphoric time period where people were so patriotic and so unapologetically pro-rule Britannia, cool Britannia, as I said earlier. And at the same time, we had very little in terms of actual immigration. I mean, yes, we'd been having immigration, and yeah, there was resistance to it, especially through the 70s with the National Front, but it was mainly confined to the big cities. Places like London, Bristol, Manchester, Leeds. There were loads of pockets, vast expanses of land in the UK where nobody had ever seen an immigrant before. And there were still people from the older generations who harbored prejudiced attitudes towards immigrants. But that all began to change by the time Tony Blair and the new Labour revolution came in, because they took the they took immigration and cranked it all the way up to 11, and at the same time they enacted a series of policy proposals and laws that made it even more taboo to talk about and criticize immigration. Speaking of which, that reminds me, another thing that happened in the late 90s was the Macpherson inquiry. So, I don't know if any of you remember this. I remember hearing about it at one point. There was a black teenager by the name of Stephen Lawrence. He was walking around in London one day and he got stabbed by a gang of white racists. It's unfortunate, but honestly, a black guy getting stabbed in London, it happens like every minute of every hour. But this one provided the logical impetus that the then ruling class, the then ruling elite of the time, needed to press onward with their millenarian utopianistic fervor. Because you see, the investigation of the killing of Stephen Lawrence was poorly handled by the police. So they commissioned an inquiry into it by a chap by the name of, what was his name? John Macpherson? I forget. I'll double check that later. Anyway, Macpherson, who came to the conclusion that the police were institutionally racist. And this sent shockwaves all throughout the press. And ever since then, there's been a top-down, concentrated effort by our political class to make everything not racist, to make anti-racism official state policy. Multiculturalism, globalism, diversity, LGBT, they've all been state-sanctioned policies enforced by the state in one way or another.
We've got to celebrate our differences. We've got to celebrate our differences. Ooga booga doo, ooga booga doo. We've got to celebrate our...
And it all began when Blair got into power. Except, when I say that all these policies were enforced by the state, that's not completely true, because I'm not giving you the full picture. There was another profound change that took place, again, under Blair's tenure, under the Blair administration, which has resulted in a lot of the chaos that we see nowadays. So, a lot of youngsters might be wondering, why does nothing work in this day and age? Why does it seem like, why is it that we can't deport dangerous foreign criminals, literally because his son doesn't like the chicken nuggets in his home country of Albania? Why can't we deport Jamaican rapists because they say that they're gay and if they go back to their home country they'll be attacked? And why can't we deport foreign paedophiles on the grounds that it's cruel and immoral to their family or whatever silly reason like that? Why do we keep seeing these ridiculous stories? And can our government do anything? Well, the answer is, again, it's to do with another change that took place during the new Labour revolution. It's because when Blair got into power, he and his ministerial cabinet enacted a series of reforms that created what I call the quangocracy. We saw the rise of quangos. A quango, for those of you who don't know, is a quasi-non-governmental organization. It is an organization which is supposedly on paper independent and doesn't receive any government funding, except when you check the books carefully or you see who the members of the board of that organization are, you see that they are very much government funded. I mean, some examples of quangos are organizations like Hope Not Hate, the worst of them. Stand Up to Racism. There's so many of them. There's got to be thousands of these, and we are all paying for them. We, the taxpayer, well, not me personally because I'm unemployed, but you are probably paying for them without being aware of it. The existence and of course the Supreme Court as well. I classify the British Supreme Court as a quango because none of the people on that board are elected. We are basically funding the salaries of the Supreme Court, and they have more effective power than anyone in our government. So anyway, as I was saying earlier, what was I saying earlier about quangos? Yeah, so the purpose of a quango is it's supposed to exist as a supposedly independent pressure group by a group of so-called independent thinkers who are actually there for a very specific purpose. That is to lobby the government for a particular cause, which the government wouldn't be able to enact without fear of backlash from their own voter base. So they are there to skew the conversation in a certain direction. They will lobby for things like more immigration, more taxes, more funding to the NHS, or more health workers, more speech codes, more women in ministerial cabinet positions or whatever. And they're there to give the false and misleading impression that our government is responding to the will of the people, when in reality it's not the case. And these NGOs, these quangos, they move and associate in the same circles as of course the ruling elite. And even though they're not elected, even though they don't have any real accountability, they have phenomenal power and influence. In a lot of ways, these NGOs and the civil service as well, because in a lot of ways they're basically the same, you know, that neither of them are elected into office, and they're both part of the problem. These people hold more power than our actual elected representatives. It used to be the case that our cabinet office, our civil servants, were literally there just to execute specific tasks, you know, things like paperwork or filing forms, or you know, doing things at the behest of the government. And that may have been what happened decades ago, but what has happened since then is that they've metastasized, and they've become so closely connected. They've developed a system of complex networks where, in reality, they hold more power than our politicians. Have you ever wondered, a couple of years ago, when Boris Johnson said he was going to deport those illegal immigrants, how many did he deport? Like 50 or 60, I forget. He tried to deport them off to Rwanda, the Rwanda plan, and it never got off the ground. Not a single chartered flight made its way over there because the Supreme Court blocked it. Have you ever wondered why it is that every single time a politician makes a promise like that and it never happens? It's because it's all part of political theatre. The politician will pander to right-wing sentiments and populist sentiments like, we need to bring back control of our borders, we need to stop those boat migrants, or we need to punish people who break the laws. So they will appear to do something that will satisfy the will of the people. However, this is where the quangos and the civil service come in. They effectively blockade the will of the government. They say, no, you're not doing this, it's cruel, it's immoral. And because the legal structure of this country has changed so much, again, thanks to Blair, the gift that keeps on giving, these quangos and the civil service, they effectively call the shots. they can bend government policy entirely according to their will. So in reality, even if a politician says, we will do this, they are the ones with the ability to make that happen. And if they simply choose not to, then it doesn't happen. And that's why the Rwanda plan didn't work. That's why everyone in our ministerial cabinet, and certainly everyone in Westminster, barring a few, very few exceptions, that's why none of them are able to do anything about mass immigration. But it's not even that they can't do a thing about mass immigration, or that they can't fix this country, or at least do something to save the absolute clown show mess of the country that we've gotten into. It's that they don't want to anyway, because again, everyone in this circus, every clown in this circus, because the whole thing has become a bloody circus at this point, they all know that the system is broken and corrupt, but none of them have any desire of fixing it, because culturally their brains are stuck in the 90s. During this wave of nationalism that we experienced back then, and pride that we have for a nation which honestly no longer exists. And if you guys want to hear the honest, blunt truth, I think Nigel Farage is also very much captivated by this mindset. I don't think Nigel Farage has any real intention of doing anything to stop immigration. Or I think he's purely in it for fame and popularity. He wants to be Prime Minister of this country so he can look good. He's kicked out so many people in his cabinet who actually have had decent solutions and policy ideas that could help put this country in the right direction, that could help us all course correct. People like Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe and Godfrey Bloom as well, even going back to his days in UKIP. But they are all basically the same. Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries, Nigel Farage, Keir Starmer, they are all stuck in the framework of the late 90s Cool Britannia mentality. Speaking of Keir Starmer, back when he was younger, he worked as a human rights lawyer. And what he would do is, he would travel around the world, he'd go to foreign countries, and he would represent some of the worst criminal scum on earth, literal rapists, murderers, and pedophiles, and he would lobby for them to not get the death penalty. He'd make sure they got off. And he would lobby other countries on behalf of the British government so that they would abolish the death penalty, which, by the way, is a decision that no one in this country has ever supported, myself included. But why? Why is it that so many people in this country believe in these totally outdated shibboleths of human rights and equality and more women in policy? Why is it that so many people in our government think this way? It's because this all happened. This all has its roots in the 90s, in the Cool Britannia and the New Labour Revolution. We were all swept by this millenarian fever, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it a fever, because I think it is entirely appropriate to compare this to a spell of madness. We were certainly struck by a wave of madness and hubris.
What is it in the nature of man that makes us hate and cheat and steal and kill? Why do people get off on bigotry, intolerance and racial intolerance?
Under the philosophy of human rights. That is why, if we need to make serious changes in this country, we have to scrap the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act was one of the first policy reforms, it was one of the first laws that Blair passed, and it laid the groundwork for the ridiculous the absolutely ridiculous travesties of justice that we have been seeing as of late. Anyway, I want to end this video though on a positive note. I don't think that this will last forever. You know, it's a period of mania, but like all mental illnesses, like all episodes of mental illness, this will come and go eventually. There will be a fierce backlash to it. I'm not even kidding. It will hit you like a train if you're not expecting it. We will have politicians. I don't know when. Maybe it will be by 2029. Maybe it'll be before that. Maybe it'll be after. Certainly by the 2030s, we will have politicians saying we're going to be sending all of them back. We're going to scrap the Human Rights Act because we have gone way too far. This runaway individualism of the late 90s, where we all believed in equality, mass immigration, and diversity, it can't last forever. Currently, as I record this video, there are protests going on all over the country. There's some in Portsmouth, which is literally only a couple of miles from where I live currently. There are the people who are staying in our taxpayer-funded hotel accommodation. They know that they're not wanted here. And by the way, the vast majority of them are adult men, and they know that they're just here to exploit a broken system. They're not actual refugees fleeing from a conflict. No one believes that. It's only a matter of time before the insane, ridiculous, ideological policies that are supported by everyone in our ruling elite and our media class, they will hit the brick wall of reality, and we will pull our heads out the sand, and we will course correct. I don't think it will happen now. I don't even think it'll happen soon, but it's going to happen eventually. So you could make the case that we could be arriving at the dawn of a new revolution. There's a storm brewing. We could be reaching the end of history. Anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about now. This has been Tracking. You guys take care. Have a great day.